So this video here is to help out with the slide regarding the trigonometry and proportions. Some of the big things that people think is like, oh my gosh, I'm working with trigonometry, it's really complicated, it's really hard, it's got the sine and cosine tan thing. But one thing that they don't realize is that only thing the sine, cosine, and tangent is doing is going to give you a decimal. And once you have that decimal, you're going to plug it into a proportion equation, which are things that we've been doing cross multiplication and solve for some of you possibly years. So if we can get through that initial fear and phobia and realize that it's no different than basically solving by proportions, then the fact that it has this sine or cosine or tan component to it really is not as intimidating as you might think. So we're going to start off with just the basics refresher on how to work with proportions. And so we have 11/12 equals 7 over a. So we have a in the denominator down here. When we get to proportions, if you kind of remember, we're going to do the classic cross multiplication that we have. So this is going to give us 11a equals 7 times 12. Okay, so 11a is going to stay 11a. And 7 times 12, well, 7 times 2 is 14. Carry the 1, and so we get 84. We are going to obviously end up with a decimal, and that's okay. The opposite of multiplying by 11 is dividing both sides by 11. And so a equals, and I'm just going to go to the calculator quickly, 84 divided by 11, which is approximately 7.64, or 7 64 hundredths. That process is going to repeat as needed. If you notice down here, b is not in the denominator. But regardless, I'm still going to do cross multiplication. So I get 15b equals 22 and then 200, basically 2 zeros behind it. Next step, opposite of multiplying, is dividing. Whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. So 2200 divided by 15 gives me an answer of 146.67 approximately. So this proportions is going to repeat over and over again. So I'm going to end up in this situation as 16 times 7, 1112 equals 9c. The opposite of multiplication is division. Divided by 9, c equals 12.44. Okay, and last on our basic proportions one, cross multiplication. And again, you're always welcome to pause the video at any point in time to check your work and your answers, and then play it to see how you did and if you got it right. So I get 50 equals 21d. Divide both sides by 21, and d is going to equal 2 and 38 hundredths. Now, one thing I want you to note from here as a really important pattern is that whenever I have my variable in the denominator, what basically ends up happening is these two quantities end up switching. What was here becomes down here, and the a, which was in the denominator, moves up to where the 11 once was. And even down here, again, I have c in my denominator, and initially what's going to end up happening is you're going to get 7 times 16 divided by these two switch places, so thus divided by 9. So it's a neat little trick that you can start doing of going, well, this is the denominator, so it's just going to switch places with that, and whatever this answer is after you multiply is going to be divided by this value here. It's going to be divided by this value here that switches places with that variable. So that's basic proportions. To show the fact that this doesn't change even when working with a decimal. Remember, when the sine, cosine, tangent turns a value into a decimal, well, then we're working with proportions. Well, proportions with decimals is going to be the same exact process. I'm going to, I got a in the denominator here, so I'm actually going to do a cheat because technically this is going to switch places and this is going to multiply. So I'm going to end up with a equals 19 times 7 divided by 0.8. I can just go ahead and just do a straight up switch because technically I'd multiply by a and then I'd divide by 0.8 anyways. So I might as well just switch those now. So to my nifty calculator, 19 times 7 divided by 0.8 or 8/10, and I get 166.25. Okay. So when I work with decimals, and since I'm going to do another implement to show a little cheat here, since I have these numbers down here, I would traditionally multiply and then divide again. So I'm actually just going to leave it where it's at. And what I mean, if you look up here at number 4, so I multiplied by 21, cross multiplied, and got 21D. And then, well, I just had to divide by 21 again. Anyways, so I basically could completely ignore this step and just leave the 21 there, because whatever 5 times 10 is going to be divided by this number anyways. So I might as well leave it instead of multiplying and then dividing by it again. So this actually is going to become b equals 107 times 2 all over 3.15. Because traditionally I'd multiply, but then I'd divide. So I might as well just leave it. Okay. And then down here, I'd do the same thing. I'd get 107 times 2, my answer, divided by a decimal. I can do that. And equals. And I get an answer, which I could, in this situation, I basically could round to 68 if I wanted to. Approximately 68. All right. And so here, 7. I'm going to multiply this across here. I'm not going to bother moving my 23 because I just have to divide by it anyways. So quick in my calculator, 6 times 7.7 divided by 23. Boom, I have my answer. It's basically 2. So all I did was 7.7 times 6 divided by 23. Down here, I'm going to switch these two quantities and I'm going to multiply here. So I'm going to get D equals 21 times 8 divided by 1.7. So whether I'm doing proportions in general, proportions with decimals, it doesn't matter. I'm going to solve them all the exact same way. So the reason why I have you set these up is because this is going to fall into our next section, which is working with trig. And again, you're welcome to pause and replay any section of this video that might help you with working through these, because I know I am going through them kind of fast. So let's come over here and look at our trig component to it. So if you notice number 1 that I have sine 80 equals x over 40. Well, this is kind of similar to, well, number 4 that we have. My variable in my top, I have my other values, and I'm trying to figure out what my variable equals. The only thing that's really different from this and this is I first have to solve for my sine. And I do that by coming to my calculator and literally hit sine. It looks like sin, but it's sine. 80 equals. And I'm going to get a decimal. Traditionally, we'll round to about the hundredths place. So sine 80 is the same as 0.98 or 98 hundredths. This quantity and this quantity are the same thing. That's what it equals. The sine of 80 is 98 hundredths. So now I'm just working with basically decimals in a proportion problem. This is trig. This is decimals and proportion problems. I just entered that into my calculator. That's the only extra step between those two. So I'm going to cross multiply. So it's going to be 40 times 0.98. Go to my calculator, and there might be some rounding error whether you keep it a true 40 times sine 80. If you notice, I'll get basically 39.39. If I was to do 40 times 0.98, I get 39.2. So there might be a variance in your answers depending on how, kind of like pi, whether you use pi or if you use 3.14, just kind of depending on your numbers. Both of these are absolutely correct. And I'm done. I just did trigonometry. So let's come down to number 2, sine 70. Okay? So I'm going to go to my calculator. I'm going to hit sine 70. And I'm going to change it into a decimal. So I have 0.94 equals 45 over x. Well, I already learned in my previous example in working with proportions that if I have the variable in my denominator, I can just switch those. So that gives me x equals 45 divided by 0.94 or 94 hundredths, which is 45, and I just go to my calculator. So x equals, if I want to do more exact, 47.87. And sometimes when we get closer to working with degrees and angles, it'd be approximately 48 degrees would be my approximate angle. Take your trig, turn it into decimal, work your proportion like you would any other proportion with decimals. Cosine. Not going to do anything different, but I'm going to hit the cosine button. Cosine 60. It's what it says. It's what I do. It gives me, ooh, a nice pretty decimal. To solve for x, you can pretend if you want to that there's an imaginary 1 underneath here. It's perfectly fine. I'm going to multiply by 55. So x equals 27.5. And when this gets into trig, it would just be a matter of being a degree. Or a side length, depending on what we're looking for. Okay? So, cosine 60. Take a moment, pause it if you want to. Oh, I already did cosine 60. Well, we already know the answer to that one. I'm going to cheat and make it an 80. Okay, so cosine 80. Oh, I switched them. That's what I did. Okay, either way, cosine 80 is 0.17 equals 55 over x. All I'm going to do is flip these. So x equals 55 over 0.17. So 55 divided by 0.17. Okay. And just in case you had done cosine 60, I will go ahead and do that one just so you can see it in case you had already started that one. So we already know cosine of 60 is 0.5. And I just know that from my previous problem over here. So x would equal 55 divided by 0.5, or half, basically. But since it's divided by a half, remember you're going to flip it. And so it's the same thing as x equals 110. Worst case scenario, use your calculator. If you can't remember about dividing by 1/2 and the division of a fraction, worry about your calculator at this point in time. Okay, last but not least, same concept, but now I have tan 55. Okay, so tan 55 equals 1 for, I'm going to say 3. 80 over x, I'm going to exchange those and switch their locations. And now I'm just going to do basic divided by 1.43. So x equals basically approximately 56. If you put down 55.94, you're still absolutely correct. So remember, this was just proportions. You cross multiply, but then you divide anyways, so you might as well just put it down there to begin with. So that is part of the lesson. That is some of the more complicated parts of trigonometry, is actually just the proportions. And that's why I wanted us to practice those, to realize that you're only changing this into this, and then from here, it's the same exact thing as any of these before that you've been doing and already know how to do. So don't freak out. You just have to fill in the boxes and walk through the steps and be able to solve them. All right. Feel free to send me a message if you need any additional help. Otherwise, let me know. I hope this helped.